£400 billion of fiscal support is starting to slip away. It was the cash propping up an economy in free fall and added up to the biggest peacetime support package seen in British history. But now that chapter is coming to a close, and the squeeze on household incomes looks set to begin.
What's happening in terms of prices is the biggest upward pressure we've seen in a decade, from rising energy prices in particular. But because that is combined with big cuts to benefits, this is not like anything we've seen this century. This is a big cost of living squeeze this winter, and it's going to be low-income families who are, front and centre in the front line of that hit.
The furlough scheme has helped pay the wages of 11.6 million workers. It's cost £70 billion, but today it comes to an end. The beleaguered hospitality sector will see its VAT bill rise from 5 to 12.5% today, and house buyers will no longer be able to access the stamp duty holiday. But the most controversial change remains the end to the £20 a week universal credit uplift, which goes next week. For people like Karen Isaac, that extra cash has been a lifeline, and she dreads it disappearing.
I can't sleep of a night because I seriously just worry about it all the time. I won't be able to afford heat in the house. I won't be able to put food on my plate. The worry, the main thing actually for me is the mental health, which is so underestimated because it's the stress all the time. It's there, and it makes you feel worthless. It makes me feel like I'm this small.
Today, the government announced a new £500 million fund for struggling households to meet basic costs like food and heating through the winter, underlying the pressures facing low-income families. But the move was heavily criticised by charities for being inadequate, given it remains just a fraction of the £6 billion being withdrawn from universal credit. The Chancellor was on a visit close to his constituency in Yorkshire today, promising not to turn his back on those who need help, even if the type of support is scaled back.
There were things that we did during the crisis to help people get through the worst part of coronavirus. And I think, like furlough ending, the UC uplift, it's natural that those things will come to an end. But we're not done supporting people. Our plan for jobs is literally throwing the kitchen sink at helping people get the skills they need and find new opportunities.
But while furlough has protected the jobs market, pockets of vulnerable people remain.
Save travel! Save travel!
Airlines still caught up in travel bans have had half of their staff on the scheme over the summer, and it's unclear how many of those jobs will manage to come back. While the over 60s have taken over from the young as the biggest age group still on furlough, with many of those made redundant increasingly unable to rejoin the workforce. What a moment then for petrol prices to hit an 8-year high and domestic energy costs to soar. The economy as a whole could also face an era of stagflation, when growth falls back but inflation climbs, a slow rotting combination for UK PLC.
Turning the economy back on is actually much more difficult than just switching it back off.
And does the Chancellor have any levers to pull in this?
Well, absolutely. He cannot go ahead with the cut to universal credit, which is the part of this that is like a kind of, Exocet missile fired at the living standards of low-income Britain.
The worst recession in 300 years saw employment fall by only 3%, a remarkable success for the Chancellor. But that chapter is ending, and the recovery, already stuttering with supply chain shocks and shortages, looks like it will bring a whole new set of challenges for Mr. Sunak.
Elia Ibrahimi. Well, we're joined now by Dr. Miata Fanbula of the New Economics Foundation and by Professor Philip Booth of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Dr. Fanbula, furlough's been costing so far £68 billion. We can't possibly afford that sort of money for long, can we?
Well, I think you have to think about the counterfactual. Imagine if we hadn't have had the furlough scheme, the absolute scarring impact on the economy, which quite frankly would cost far more. But, for me, the key thing is furlough was put in order to deal with an economic crisis. We are not out of that crisis yet. We're not out of the woods yet. And it feels incredibly short term to be trying to pull the brakes on it. With the analysis we've done with the New Economics Foundation suggests of the million people still on furlough, about 700,000 will be at risk of redundancy. And to be doing it at the same time as you're cutting universal credit will not just push lots of families into hardship, but it will have a knock-on effect on the economy and on the recovery. We need people to spend to stimulate the economy. The government's about to put a brake on that. It's complete madness.
But in fairness, there are about 1 million job vacancies at the moment. Why should we go on paying to keep people off work?
Because there's a mismatch. So, you might have 1 million people on furlough, but they will not necessarily have the skills in order to fill those vacancies. We should be doing what other countries are doing. You look across to Europe, look across to Germany, they've kept a permanent scheme because they know that they can turn it on and turn it off at moments of crisis. They can deploy it to particular sectors. What we should be saying is, actually, there's a whole lot of people we need to retrain. Let's not just dump them onto the labour market, have mass redundancies and have the negative impacts of that. Let's get people working part-time, subsidised by furlough and retraining, and then we can move people into the jobs that are being created and into the jobs that exist. But just to say we've got 1 million jobs, we're going to turn off furlough, a whole lot of people who don't have the right skill sets will be dumped onto the labour market, makes absolutely no sense.
Professor Booth, there are about 1 million people still on furlough. Why are we pulling the rug from under them when the pandemic isn't over? Spain has just extended its furlough right through to February.
Well, I think some of these continental European models of labour markets are not really the right ones to follow. They tend to have very high levels of youth unemployment and very high levels of long-term unemployment. And over 90% of the people who were on furlough are now no longer on furlough. At the same time, and it's one of the reasons why we have so many supply pressures within the economy, shortages in shops, care homes are unable to employ care workers, shortages of teachers, and shortages of people working in catering as well in those businesses which have gone back to normal. There are huge numbers of job vacancies in those areas, whilst at the same time we're paying people to do nothing. Now, this was, or to work a very limited number of hours. Now, this made some sense when we thought that the impact of the pandemic was going to last a relatively short period of time, and we could kind of freeze the economy in aspic for a few weeks or even 2 or 3 months. But we're now talking about 18 or 19 months. The UK labour market creates and destroys about 5 million jobs every year, about 500,000 jobs, roughly speaking, every month. Patterns of demand and supply change all the time, and furlough is stopping people from moving into the new jobs which will be created in the post-COVID economy. We don't know whether or not the air transport sector will expand to its previous pre-COVID size. If it does, we don't know what the patterns of demand and supply will be, but we do know that there are significant labour shortages in certain parts of the economy.
Right. Well, Dr. Van Buller, it's much harder to find a job when you're out of work, isn't it? Isn't it wrong to end furlough and break that link with their current jobs?
100%. All the lessons of any industrial transition, and by the way, we are going through a transition at the moment. There are sectors like aviation that may not recover from the fallout of this pandemic. And, we have a choice. You either just say, well, let's leave it to the market, it will all work itself out. By the way, when we've done that in the past, the impact on our communities has lasted for generations. It is deeply scarring. It is far better to say, actually, there is the opportunity to retrain people. It's much easier to be engaged in the labour market if you are in a job. So stay part-time. A whole lot of people who are on furlough are working part hours, retrain the rest of the time, and then have that transition that is smooth and that's just. It is a choice that we have. We've made this mistake in the past. We made it in the 1980s. We've made it coming out of other economic crises. We have a choice to do something different. And the Chancellor and the government are making a choice. It's short term and it will come back and bite them.
Professor Booth, Helia's report, we saw a pensioner who's already lying awake worrying about whether the loss of the extra £20 universal credit payment will mean she has to choose between heating and eating. Won't that increase inequality?
Well, there's no doubt that if you take on its own this prospective change in universal credit payments that and assume nothing else happens at all, it will increase inequality. But I've been on this programme before, as well as written extensively about the real problem in the United Kingdom is not that we don't have a big enough welfare system and a high enough level of tax. After all, our tax burden is roughly now at post Second World War highs. It's that we have extraordinarily high level of living costs, especially housing costs. And the government has been supporting the housing market with demand side measures, which is pushing up housing costs further, whilst not doing anything at all in relation to promoting the increased supply of housing. And of course, the government is facing increased protests from its backbenchers to stop the very limited reforms that it has proposed going through. No, we have to address the problem of
alas, we have to move on, Professor Booth. I'm sorry to close it there, but thank you very much indeed, Professor Booth and Dr. Van Buller. Thank you both warmly.